The early morning sun cast long shadows across Frank Whitaker's carefully tended front yard as he slowly made his way down his worn wooden porch steps. At 93 years old, he moved carefully but purposefully, each step a testament to his determination to maintain his independence. The small town of Millbrook was just waking up, and the familiar smell of fresh bread from Wilson's bakery 2 blocks away brought a gentle smile to his weathered face. Frank had lived in the same modest white house on Cedar Street for over 50 years. The neighborhood had changed around him, but his daily routine remained the same. Every morning, rain or shine, he would walk the 3 blocks to Mary's Diner for his breakfast: 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and a cup of black coffee. The old veteran took pride in his home's appearance. His garden, though smaller now than in previous years, still bloomed with bright red roses and yellow marigolds. The American flag that hung by his front door was always crisp and clean, replaced every 6 months without fail. His late wife Martha had started that tradition, and he kept it going even 15 years after her passing. This particular Tuesday morning seemed like any other until Frank heard the first rumble. At first, it was distant, like approaching thunder. But unlike a storm, the sound grew louder and more mechanical. The peaceful morning air was suddenly filled with the roar of motorcycle engines, and not just one or two. It sounded like a whole group of them. Frank paused at his mailbox, his hand gripping the metal post a little tighter as 5 motorcycles turned onto his street. They were heading toward the abandoned Johnson property next door, an empty lot that had been vacant since the old hardware store burned down 2 years ago. The bikers were young men, their leather vests decorated with patches he couldn't quite make out from this distance. As they parked their bikes on the gravelly lot, more motorcycles arrived. The quiet morning Frank had known for decades was now filled with loud conversations, laughter, and the constant revving of engines. He watched as they set up what looked like a makeshift gathering spot, complete with folding chairs and coolers. Mrs. Henderson, his neighbor from across the street, came out onto her porch in her morning robe, coffee cup in hand. She gave Frank a concerned look and shook her head disapprovingly at the scene unfolding before them. The noise was enough to make several other neighbors peek out their windows or step onto their porches. Frank, still standing by his mailbox, thought about his options. As a veteran who had served in World War II, he had faced much worse situations than this. He had learned during his service that the first step in any conflict was to assess the situation calmly. Taking a deep breath, he decided to approach the group. As he walked toward the lot, he noticed how young these men were. Most couldn't have been older than his youngest grandson, Tommy. Some of them spotted him approaching, and their reactions weren't encouraging. A few smirked, while others just stared, their conversation dying down slightly. "Good morning," Frank said, his voice clear and steady despite his age. "I'm Frank Whitaker. I live next door." He gestured toward his house. One of the younger men, wearing a black leather vest covered in patches, stepped forward. He looked Frank up and down, a slight smirk playing on his face. "Something wrong, old-timer?" he asked, his tone making it clear he wasn't particularly interested in Frank's concerns. "I just wanted to introduce myself," Frank replied calmly, though he could feel his heart beating a bit faster. "This lot has been quiet for a long time. It caught me by surprise to have so much activity here this morning." Some of the bikers laughed, and one of them deliberately revved his engine, causing Frank to flinch slightly at the sudden noise. The apparent leader of the group, the one who had spoken, took a step closer to Frank. "Well, get used to it, Grandpa," he said, his voice carrying a clear note of challenge. "We like this spot, and we're planning to make it our regular meeting place." Frank stood his ground, his military training from decades ago kicking in. He kept his posture straight and his expression neutral, even as he recognized that this situation was going to be more complicated than he had hoped. As he looked around at the growing group of bikers, he realized that this morning marked the end of his peaceful life on Cedar Street, unless he could find a way to handle this situation with the wisdom that only his 93 years of life experience could provide. Over the next 2 weeks, Frank's quiet life turned into a daily struggle. The bikers made the empty lot their permanent hangout spot, showing up at all hours with no regard for the neighborhood's peace. What started as morning gatherings soon extended into late-night parties, with motorcycles roaring past his house well past midnight. One particularly hot afternoon, Frank sat in his favorite armchair by the window, trying to read his newspaper. The constant rumble of engines made it impossible to concentrate. His hands shook slightly as he turned the pages, not from age but from frustration. The framed photos on his wall, showing him in his military uniform from 1945, seemed to watch him with silent understanding. Mrs. Henderson had already called the police twice, but the officers could do little. The bikers weren't technically breaking any laws by gathering on the empty lot, and they would quiet down just enough when warned, only to resume their noisy behavior once the police left. That evening, as Frank watered his beloved rose garden, 3 of the younger bikers decided to have some fun at his expense. They circled their motorcycles around the edge of his property, deliberately revving their engines. The noise was so loud it scared away the cardinals that usually visited his bird feeder. "Hey, Grandpa," one of them shouted, cupping his hands around his mouth. "Those flowers match your rosy cheeks." The others laughed, making exaggerated old man gestures that mocked Frank's careful movements. Frank's grip tightened on his garden hose, but he remembered what his commanding officer had taught him years ago. The first person to lose their temper loses the battle. He continued watering his plants, acting as if he couldn't hear them. The next morning at Mary's diner, Frank's hands trembled slightly as he lifted his coffee cup. Mary, the owner who had known him for 20 years, noticed something was wrong. His usual cheerful demeanor was replaced by dark circles under his eyes and a worried frown. "Those bikers still giving you trouble, Frank?" Mary asked, refilling his cup without being asked. The diner was quiet this early, with just a few regulars scattered at different tables. "They're getting bolder," Frank replied, his voice tired. "Last night, they were out there until 2 in the morning. Someone threw empty cans into my yard." At the counter, a truck driver named Bill spoke up. "It ain't right, what they're doing to you, Mr. Whitaker. You've fought for this country. You deserve some peace and quiet in your own home." Frank appreciated the support, but he knew sympathy wouldn't solve his problem. As he walked home from the diner, he found more evidence of the bikers' disrespect. Someone had spray-painted a crude walker symbol on his mailbox, with the words "Old Timer Crossing" beneath it. That afternoon, Frank decided to make one more attempt at peaceful communication. He baked a batch of cookies using Martha's old recipe, the one she always said could sweeten any sour situation. With the plate in his slightly shaking hands, he walked over to the lot where about 10 bikers were gathered. "Thought you might enjoy these," Frank said, holding out the plate. Some of the bikers looked surprised, while others exchanged mocking glances. Their leader, the same young man from the first day, stepped forward. His name was Jake, Frank had learned, though they'd never been properly introduced. Jake looked at the cookies, then knocked the plate out of Frank's hands. The cookies scattered across the gravel as several bikers laughed. "We don't need your pity cookies, old man," Jake sneered. "Why don't you do everyone a favor and move to a retirement home?" Frank stood there, looking down at the scattered cookies. Martha's recipe, now ground into the dirt. For the first time since the bikers had arrived, he felt something beyond frustration. A familiar feeling stirred in his chest, one he hadn't experienced since his military days. It wasn't anger, exactly, but determination. As he walked back to his house, Frank could hear them laughing behind him, but his mind was already working on a plan. He hadn't survived World War II by giving up when things got tough. These young men thought they were dealing with a helpless old man, but they were about to learn that age and experience could be powerful weapons when used correctly. That evening, Frank sat at his kitchen table with a notepad, a stack of old photographs, and his reading glasses. If these bikers wanted to play hardball, he would show them how a veteran handles a tactical situation. His hands weren't shaking anymore. Frank Whitaker sat at his old oak desk, the lamp casting a warm glow over the items spread before him, his smartphone, a gift from his grandson who had insisted he learn to use it, a leather-bound notebook, and his old military compass. The clock on the wall showed 5:30 a.m. He had always believed that wars were won before sunrise. Over his morning coffee, Frank began putting his plan into action. First, he set up his grandson's old camera on the windowsill, positioning it to record the empty lot. Then, he pulled out his phone and opened the notes app his grandson had taught him to use. His weathered fingers moved slowly, but deliberately across the screen as he documented everything. June 15th, 5:45 a.m., he wrote. First motorcycle arrived, red Harley-Davidson, license plate number. Frank recorded every detail with military precision, just as he had been trained to do during his reconnaissance missions in 1945. Throughout the day, Frank maintained his usual routine, but with a purpose. During his morning walk to Mary's diner, he used his phone to take photos of the scattered beer cans and trash the bikers had left on the sidewalk. He noted the time of each motorcycle's arrival and departure, recording their noise levels using a decibel meter app his grandson had installed. What surprised the bikers most was that Frank seemed to have disappeared. No more attempts at friendly conversations, no more complaints. The old man just watched from his window, always writing in his notebook. Some of the younger members found it unsettling. "Hey, Jake," one of them called out to their leader. "The old-timer's been taking pictures and writing stuff down. What's he up to?" Jake laughed it off, but Frank could see the uncertainty in his eyes. "Probably writing his memoirs," Jake shouted back, revving his engine extra loud. "Or maybe he's making a list for Santa." What they didn't know was that Frank was building something more powerful than any complaint. He was creating a record. Every noise violation, every instance of harassment, every piece of litter was documented with military precision. He noted license plate numbers, times, dates, and took clear photographs. One afternoon, as Frank worked in his garden, he overheard a conversation that made him smile for the first time in weeks. Two of the younger bikers were talking in hushed tones. "My dad says his business got a letter," one whispered. "Something about his company truck being parked here during that late-night party last week. Had pictures and everything." Frank continued pruning his roses, pretending not to hear. His strategy was working. He had started sending detailed reports to the local businesses that employed some of the bikers. Not complaints, just facts, dates, times, photographs, and noise readings, all presented with professional courtesy and military precision. The following morning, Frank noticed something different. The usual crowd of bikers had thinned considerably. Those who remained seemed more subdued, casting nervous glances at his window where the camera lens glinted in the morning sun. Later that day, while Frank sat on his porch enjoying a rare moment of relative quiet, an unexpected visitor approached. It was one of the older bikers, a man probably in his 50s, who Frank had noted was usually quieter than the others. "Mr. Whitaker," the man said, removing his sunglasses. "Name's Tom. I served too. Desert Storm. Been meaning to talk to you about all this." Frank gestured to the empty chair beside him, his face neutral but attentive. As Tom sat down, he pulled out a folded piece of paper, one of Frank's detailed reports. "My boss got this yesterday," Tom said, shaking his head with a mix of respect and embarrassment. "Never seen anything so well documented since my military days. Got me thinking about how we've been acting." Frank nodded slowly, saying nothing. Sometimes, as he had learned in the war, silence was the strongest response. "Look," Tom continued, "some of us, well, we forgot what it means to show respect, especially to a fellow veteran." He paused, looking at the American flag gently waving on Frank's porch. "I talked to a few of the guys, the ones who served or whose fathers or grandfathers did. We're going to make some changes." As Tom spoke, Frank allowed himself a small smile. His strategy hadn't just been about documenting bad behavior. It was about revealing character. Sometimes, he thought, the best way to fight a battle wasn't with fists or angry words, but with patience, intelligence, and the kind of strategic thinking that only comes from years of experience. The war wasn't over yet, but Frank knew he had just won an important battle. Frank's usual spot at Mary's diner felt different that morning. Instead of sitting alone with his eggs and coffee, he found himself sharing his booth with Mark Thompson, a retired police sergeant who had taken notice of the ongoing situation with the bikers. "I've been watching what's been happening," Mark said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "Those reports you've been sending out, they're impressive, very professional." He paused, then added, "Remind me of the ones I used to write on the force." Frank nodded, cutting into his eggs. "Military training never really leaves you," he replied quietly. "Document everything. Leave no detail unrecorded." The diner was busier than usual that morning. Several regular customers kept glancing their way, and Frank could hear snippets of conversations about the biker problem. News traveled fast in small towns like Millbrook. "Thing is, Frank," Mark leaned forward, lowering his voice, "I did some digging of my own. That leader of theirs, Jake, his grandfather served in the Pacific Theater, same as you." Frank's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. "William Bull Morrison," Mark continued. fought at Iwo Jima. Jake probably doesn't even know about it. His father doesn't talk about family history much since his grandfather passed. This information stirred something in Frank's memory. The name Morrison had seemed familiar when he'd written it in his notes, but he couldn't place it until now. Bull Morrison, he repeated softly. I knew him, not during the war, but after. He used to own the hardware store 2 towns over. As they talked, Mary came by with fresh coffee. She hesitated, then spoke. You know, my nephew works at the garage where some of those bikers get their motorcycles serviced. Says they've been talking about you, Mr. Whitaker. Your documentation has got them worried. Some of them are starting to feel ashamed. The bell above the diner's door chimed, and conversation suddenly hushed. Jake walked in, alone for once, without his usual swagger. He ordered coffee to go, deliberately avoiding looking in Frank's direction. But Frank noticed something he hadn't seen before, a small, worn photograph partially visible in Jake's wallet as he paid. Mark noticed it too. That's Bull Morrison in that photo, he whispered after Jake left. He carries it, but probably doesn't know the whole story. His grandfather was a hero, saved his entire unit. Throughout the day, more allies emerged. Mrs. Henderson had been sharing Frank's reports with her book club, which included several influential community members. The local newspaper editor stopped by Frank's house, interested in running a story about respect for veterans and community values. By late afternoon, Frank's porch had become an impromptu meeting place. Mark had brought over old military records and photographs. Tom, the veteran biker from the day before, joined them with his own service memorabilia. Even Mary from the diner stopped by with sandwiches and iced tea. You've started something here, Frank, Mark said, looking through the gathered documents. This isn't just about quiet neighborhoods anymore. It's about connecting generations, remembering our history. As they talked, they noticed Jake's motorcycle slow down as it passed the house. This time, instead of revving the engine, he almost seemed to be listening to their conversation. His grandfather would be proud of your approach, Frank, Tom said, watching Jake ride away. Bull Morrison always believed in handling things with intelligence rather than force. Said he learned that the hard way in the Pacific. Frank looked at the old photographs spread across his porch table, young faces in uniform, brave men who had served their country. Among them was a photo of Bull Morrison, standing tall and proud in his dress uniform. Maybe, Frank said slowly, it's time to share these stories. Not just document problems, but remember why we served in the first place. To protect not just our country, but our communities, our families. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across Frank's well-tended garden, the small group on his porch continued to plan. They weren't just gathering evidence anymore, they were building bridges across generations. Tomorrow, Mark suggested, let's invite Jake for coffee. Show him these photos, tell him about his grandfather. Sometimes, understanding where you come from changes where you're going. Frank nodded, looking at the empty lot next door where a few motorcycles were still parked. The evening was quieter than usual, and he wondered if perhaps the tide was finally turning. Sometimes, he thought, the best allies come from the most unexpected places. The next morning dawned with an unusual quiet over Cedar Street. Frank sat at Mary's diner earlier than usual, surrounded by old photographs and newspaper clippings spread carefully on the table. Mark Thompson sat beside him, while Tom, the veteran biker, occupied the seat across. They were waiting for Jake. Are you sure he'll come? Mary asked, setting down a fresh pot of coffee. She'd opened the diner an hour early just for this meeting. Frank nodded, his weathered hands arranging the old photographs. Tom spoke to him yesterday, said he was curious about his grandfather. The bell above the diner's door chimed at exactly 7 o'clock. Jake stood in the doorway, looking uncomfortable without his usual leather vest and biker gear. In regular clothes, he looked younger, almost vulnerable. Sit down, son, Frank said, gesturing to the empty chair. Jake hesitated, then slowly made his way to the table. That's him, Frank said softly, sliding an old photograph across the table. Your grandfather, William Bull Morrison, Iwo Jima, 1945. Jake picked up the photo with trembling hands. The young Marine in the picture stood proud and tall, looking remarkably like Jake himself. I've never seen this picture before, he said quietly. Mark pulled out more documents from his folder. Your grandfather was a hero, Jake, He saved his entire unit during a Japanese counterattack. But that's not all he did. Over the next hour, as the morning sun streamed through the diner's windows, they shared stories about Bull Morrison, how he'd returned from the war and opened a hardware store, how he'd helped other veterans find jobs, get back on their feet, how he'd organized the first motorcycle charity ride for the local children's hospital. He rode motorcycles? Jake asked, surprised. Tom nodded. That's right. He believed that riding wasn't just about making noise and showing off. It was about freedom, brotherhood, and helping others. Jake sat silently, absorbing everything. His eyes moved from photograph to photograph, document to document. His grandfather's life was spread before him, telling a story he'd never known. There's something else, Frank said, pulling out one final photograph. It showed two young Marines standing together, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. That's your grandfather on the right, and that's me on the left. Jake's head snapped up, his eyes wide. You knew my grandfather. We served together for a brief time, Frank explained. Lost touch after the war, but I never forgot him. When you and your friends started gathering in that lot, I recognized your last name, but I couldn't place it until Mark here did some digging. Mary quietly placed a plate of breakfast in front of Jake, who hadn't even noticed she was there. His hands shook slightly as he picked up another photograph. Dad never talks about him, Jake said softly. After Grandpa died, it was like that part of our family history died too. I didn't know any of this. The morning grew later, and regular customers began trickling in. They gave the group curious looks, but kept their distance, sensing the importance of what was happening. Your grandfather believed in bringing people together, not driving them apart, Frank said. He used his motorcycle club to raise money for veterans, for families in need. He understood that true strength isn't about intimidation, it's about building community. Jake looked at the empty lot through the diner's window, then back at the photographs of his grandfather. We've been using that space all wrong, he said finally. Everything we've been doing. It's not what he would have wanted. Tom placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. It's not too late to change things, kid. Your grandfather's legacy doesn't have to end with him. As they talked, more of Jake's fellow bikers began appearing outside the diner, drawn by word spreading through their network. They peered through the windows, seeing their leader sitting with Frank, surrounded by history. I need to make this right, Jake said, standing up. He looked at Frank with new eyes, seeing not just an old man, but a connection to his own past. And I think I know how. Frank watched as Jake walked outside to talk to his friends, the old photographs still clutched in his hands. Sometimes, he thought, the best way to solve a problem isn't through confrontation or documentation, but through understanding where people come from and helping them remember who they are meant to be. The investigation had revealed more than just facts and figures. It had uncovered a forgotten legacy that would change everything. The community center's meeting room was packed on a warm Saturday morning. Frank sat in the front row, his military posture still perfect despite his age. Around him, an unlikely mix of people had gathered, bikers in their leather vests, local business owners, veterans, and neighbors from Cedar Street. Jake stood at the podium, looking nervous but determined. Gone was the arrogant young man who had terrorized the neighborhood. In his place stood someone new, someone who had discovered his own legacy. My grandfather, William Bull Morrison, believed in using this town's spaces to bring people together. Jake began, his voice slightly shaky. Today, I want to propose something that would honor his memory and make things right. He unrolled a large blueprint across the podium. The room fell silent as he explained his idea, transforming the abandoned lot into a combination veterans memorial park and community gathering space. The front section would be a peaceful memorial garden, Jake explained, pointing to the drawings. We'd have plaques honoring local veterans, including my grandfather and Mr. Whitaker. Behind that, we're proposing a designated area for motorcycle enthusiasts to gather, but with proper sound barriers and reasonable hours. Frank watched as Jake's fellow bikers nodded in approval. Some of the older members were already discussing how they could help with the construction. And here's the best part, Jake continued, flipping to another page. We want to revive my grandfather's tradition. Every month, we'll organize charity rides for different causes. The park would be our starting point. Mrs. Henderson raised her hand. What about the noise? The late-night gatherings? Jake smiled. We've already drafted guidelines. No gatherings after 8 p.m. on weekdays, 9 p.m. on weekends. We'll install sound dampening walls around the motorcycle area. And most importantly, he looked at Frank. We'll have a committee of both bikers and residents to oversee everything. The room buzzed with conversation. Mark Thompson stood up next. As a retired police sergeant, I've reviewed their proposal. It's solid. They thought of everything. Parking, noise control, safety measures. This could really work. Frank watched as his neighbors, who just weeks ago had been calling the police about the bikers, now leaned forward with interest. The transformation wasn't just in the proposed park, it was in the people themselves. Tom, the veteran biker, took the podium next. We've already secured pledges from local businesses. The motorcycle shop where I work will donate materials. Johnson's Construction, they employ 3 of our members, has offered to help with the building. The meeting continued for 2 hours. Questions were asked, concerns addressed, suggestions made. Through it all, Frank sat quietly, watching his community come together in a way he hadn't seen since his younger days. Finally, the mayor stood up. I think we've heard enough to put this to a vote. All in favor of approving the Veterans Memorial and Community Park project. Hands rose across the room, leather-clad arms alongside business suits and Sunday dresses. The movement was nearly unanimous. After the meeting, Jake approached Frank, holding out his hand. Mr. Whitaker, would you consider being the chairman of the Parks Oversight Committee? We need someone with your experience, someone who understands both military honor and community building. Frank looked at the young man's extended hand, the same hand that had knocked away his peace offering of cookies just weeks ago. He stood up slowly, his blue eyes clear and bright. On one condition, Frank said, taking Jake's hand. We named the memorial garden after your grandfather. The Bull Morrison Memorial Garden has a nice ring to it. Jake's eyes glistened. Thank you, sir. We'll make this right. We'll make it something you would have been proud of. As people filed out of the meeting room, Frank overheard snippets of conversation. Bikers were exchanging phone numbers with local business owners. Veterans were sharing stories with younger residents. Mrs. Henderson was discussing flower arrangements with one of the toughest-looking bikers Frank had ever seen. Outside, the sun was bright, and for the first time in weeks, the empty lot next door didn't feel like a battlefield anymore. Instead, it felt like what it was about to become, a place of healing, remembrance, and community. Sometimes, Frank thought, the best solutions don't come from fighting or forcing change. They come from finding common ground, from remembering who we are and who we can be. As he walked home that day, he couldn't help but think that somewhere, Bull Morrison was smiling down on them all. The summer sun beat down on the abandoned lot, but it wasn't empty anymore. Yellow construction vehicles lined the street, and the air was filled with the sounds of productive work, very different from the disruptive noise that had plagued the neighborhood just months ago. Frank sat in his favorite porch chair, watching the transformation unfold before him. Jake stood in the center of the lot, now wearing a bright yellow hard hat instead of his motorcycle helmet, directing volunteers and construction workers. The change in the young man was as remarkable as the change in the property itself. Looking good, isn't it? Mark Thompson said, climbing the porch steps with 2 cups of coffee from Mary's Diner. He handed one to Frank and settled into the adjacent chair. Better than I ever imagined, Frank replied, watching as a group of bikers worked alongside local high school students to lay the foundation for the memorial wall. The construction site was a hub of activity. Mrs. Henderson and her garden club members were marking spots for flower beds, consulting with professional landscapers. Tom and his fellow veteran bikers were installing sound dampening barriers, their expertise with machinery proving invaluable. Did you see the latest donation numbers? Mark asked, sipping his coffee. The fundraising ride last weekend brought in more than double what they expected. Seems like every business in town wants to be part of this now. Frank nodded, remembering the impressive sight of over 100 motorcycles, their riders dressed respectfully, gathering for the charity ride. Jake had led them in a moment of silence before they started, honoring both fallen veterans and their community's new beginning. The memorial garden was taking shape first. Stone pathways curved through what would soon be beds of red, white, and blue flowers. The centerpiece was a half-finished wall of polished granite, where the names of local veterans would be engraved. Mr. Whitaker, Jake called out, jogging over to the porch. He held up a tablet showing design plans. We had an idea for the entrance. Would you look it over? Frank studied the screen, noting how they'd incorporated elements from military memorials while adding their own unique touches. The entrance would feature two motorcycle wheels transformed into symbols of unity, one representing the veterans, the other the current community. Bill from the motorcycle shop had another suggestion. Jake continued, his enthusiasm evident. He wants to start a mentorship program. Pair up young riders with veterans, teach them about respect, community service, that kind of thing. As they discussed the plans, more workers arrived. The local coffee shop had sent over free drinks for all the volunteers. Mary from the diner arrived with boxes of sandwiches. What had started as a construction project had become a daily community gathering. Oh, and Mr. Whitaker, Jake added, pulling something from his pocket. We found this while clearing the lot. He handed Frank an old rusted key. Dad says it's from Grandpa's hardware store that used to be here. We thought maybe it could be incorporated into the memorial somehow. Frank turned the key over in his hands, remembering Bull Morrison's store where he bought supplies for his garden so many years ago. It would be perfect for the time capsule, he suggested, a symbol of how this place is connecting past and present. Throughout the day, Frank watched as more people came to help. Children from the elementary school arrived with their art teacher to paint murals on the sound barriers. A local tech company sent volunteers to set up solar-powered lighting along the pathways. Even the town's mayor rolled up his sleeves and helped plant trees. As the sun began to set, Jake called everyone together for their daily progress meeting. Standing among the half-finished projects and construction materials, he looked around at the diverse group gathered before him, bikers, veterans, business owners, students, and neighbors, all dusty and tired but smiling. You know, he said, his voice carrying across the lot, my grandfather used to say that the measure of a community isn't in its buildings or its laws, but in how its people come together when it matters. Frank watched from his porch as the group broke into spontaneous applause. The transformation wasn't just happening to the lot. It was happening to everyone involved. What had started as a solution to a conflict had become something much more significant, a revival of community spirit that Bull Morrison would have been proud to see. As the workers began packing up for the day, Frank smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring even more progress, more unity, and more proof that sometimes the best changes come from the most unexpected situations. On a crisp autumn morning, 6 months after the construction began, hundreds of people gathered for the grand opening of the Bull Morrison Memorial Park and Community Center. The transformation was complete, and it was more beautiful than anyone had imagined. Frank Whitaker sat in a place of honor on the newly built stage, his war medals gleaming on his chest. At 93, he still sat straight and proud, his eyes bright as he looked out over the crowd. Next to him sat Jake Morrison, wearing a clean leather vest with a new patch that read Community First Riders. The memorial garden bloomed with late-season flowers, their colors vibrant against the polished granite walls bearing veterans' names. The sound-dampening walls had been transformed into works of art, featuring murals of local history painted by school children. The motorcycle gathering area, with its specially designed acoustic barriers, stood ready for its first official meeting. Mayor Thompson stepped up to the podium. 6 months ago, this lot was a source of conflict in our community. Today, it stands as a symbol of what we can achieve when we work together. He turned to Frank. And it all started because one wise veteran chose understanding over anger. As Frank stood to cut the ribbon, supported by Jake on one side and Tom on the other, a rumble of motorcycles approached. But this time, no one complained. The Community First Riders, led by some of the same bikers who had once caused so much trouble, arrived in formation. Each bike bore an American flag, and their engines purred respectfully at low volume. My grandfather would have loved this, Jake said during his speech, his voice thick with emotion. He believed that motorcycles could bring people together, not drive them apart. Today, we're proving him right. The ceremony continued with the unveiling of special features throughout the park. The time capsule, containing Bull Morrison's old store key and other meaningful items, was sealed into the memorial wall. A plaque told the story of how the park came to be, celebrating the unlikely friendship between a 93-year-old veteran and a young biker searching for his heritage. Mrs. Henderson, speaking for the Garden Club, announced their new partnership with the Motorcycle Club for monthly charity rides. The first one would benefit local veterans services, with riders wearing patches designed by elementary school students. Local news reporters interviewed Frank about the remarkable transformation. "How did you do it?" they asked. "How did you turn enemies into allies?" Frank smiled, looking at Jake, who was showing the group of children the safe motorcycle viewing area. "Sometimes," he said, "the best way to solve a problem isn't to fight against it, but to find the humanity in it." These young people didn't need an enemy. They needed a connection to their own history, their own potential. As the day went on, the park filled with life. Children played in the safe zones while their parents chatted with bikers about upcoming charity events. Veterans shared stories in the memorial garden, their memories preserved for future generations. The sound of respectful motorcycle engines mixed with laughter and conversation. That evening, as the sun set over the park, Frank sat on his porch with Jake and Tom. They watched as community members strolled through the garden paths, admiring the lighting system that made the memorial wall glow softly in the dusk. "You know what's remarkable?" Tom said, looking at the peaceful scene. "This park hasn't just changed the neighborhood, it's changed us." Jake nodded. "We were so busy trying to make noise, we forgot how to make a difference. Mr. Whitaker taught us that." Frank shook his head modestly. "You taught yourselves. I just helped you remember who you could be." As night fell, the last visitors headed home. The park stood peaceful under the stars, its purpose fulfilled, not just as a memorial to veterans like Bull Morrison and Frank Whitaker, but as a living testament to the power of understanding across generations. "Tomorrow's the first official morning meeting of the Community First Riders," Jake said, standing to leave. "Will you join us, Mr. Whitaker? We saved you a special seat in the gathering area." Frank smiled, looking out at the park that had once been a battleground and was now a bridge between generations. "Wouldn't miss it for the world," he replied. Sometimes, the greatest victories come not from defeating an enemy, but from turning them into family. As Frank watched Jake walk to his motorcycle, its engine barely a whisper in the evening air, he knew that this was more than just a happy ending. It was a new beginning.